As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Ultimately, they're able to approach working in these environments using the four humanitarian principles: neutrality, impartiality, independence, and humanity. And these principles, for those who perhaps don't know it, a bit like commander's guidance in that military speak, that the humanitarians are always looking back at these principles when they're delivering aid. Are we able to deliver aid to those who need it? Are we able to do it in a way that isn't taking sides?
Aloha, and welcome to Dialogue, where conversations shape security. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's a pleasure to have you join us for episode 35, Indo-Pacific Humanity and Geopolitics. Today, we explore the complex intersection of humanitarian aid and geopolitics in one of the world's most dynamic and contested regions. The Indo-Pacific is home to over 65% of the world's population and faces extraordinary challenges, from the increasing impact of natural disasters to the geopolitical rivalries that influence the allocation and perception of aid. How do we address these challenges while upholding humanitarian principles? The Indo-Pacific is not just vast, it's deep, interconnected, and diverse. Countries in this region experience everything from rising sea levels in small island states to intense typhoons, prolonged droughts, and conflicts that displace millions. At the same time, the region is a focal point of strategic competition among major powers, particularly the United States and China. Aid delivery in this environment is complicated by political sensitivities, power rivalries, and the potential for aid to become a tool of influence rather than neutral support for those in need. Technology is playing an increasingly transformative role. AI, drones, and satellite imagery have opened up new possibilities for rapid disaster mapping and targeted aid delivery, as seen in responses to events like Cyclone Amphan and Australia's bushfires. However, these advancements come with challenges. How do we ensure that data collection is used ethically? What happens when technology fails in critical moments, or when it's used as a means of control rather than support? These are the pressing questions we'll address today. We'll also look at the role of civil-military collaboration in disaster responses and crises like the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami or Typhoon Haiyan. Military logistics have been critical in delivering aid to hard-reached areas. Yet such collaboration comes with tensions. How do we balance the military's resources with the neutrality required of humanitarian operations? And how can trust and coordination between military and civilian actors be improved? Another vital aspect of today's discussion is China's approach to humanitarian assistance. Its growing fleet of hospital ships, such as the Silk Road Ark and the Peace Ark, exemplifies its strategy of combining medical aid with geopolitical signaling. While these efforts provide valuable services to the region, they also raise questions about how humanitarian assistance is perceived as genuine aid or as a tool of influence. To help us untangle these complex issues, we're joined by Jonathan Robinson, an assistant professor with international programs at the U.S. Naval War College and a seasoned humanitarian advisor with a decade of experience working in high-stakes environments from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. Johnny brings invaluable insights into how geopolitics shapes humanitarian action and how aid organizations can adapt to better serve vulnerable populations. Johnny Robinson, welcome to Dialogue.
Thanks, James. It's great to be here. Very excited for our discussion today.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I like to invite our guests to share their story. So do that with us. Share with us your story.
Sure, absolutely. After my master's degree in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, I went out to the Middle East, to Syria. At the time, it was peaceful. It was a place to learn Arabic, so I started doing that. But then quite quickly got involved with the UN, supporting the UN, and that just snowballed into 10 years working in the Middle East for the UN, private security organizations, and British and Swiss humanitarian organizations, mainly focused on the aid worker security side of things, as well as conflict analysis, as well as humanitarian access. And then I finished off my time there with the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter's foundation. And as you can tell by my accent, wasn't born in the US. I'm originally from England. My wife is from Providence, Rhode Island, which is why I ended up here. And I just became a US citizen in March, which is very exciting. And now I work
Congratulations.
at the US War College.
Yeah, no, congratulations on that. And I know that you were recently promoted to assistant professor, so
Yep.
congratulations are in
Thank
order.
you. Thanks.
Yeah, well, let's start the conversation. And
Sure.
let's start with this question here. So the topic is navigating aid amid geopolitical tensions. I mean, the South China Sea, it's contested waters, and it's marked by territorial disputes,
Mhm.
militarization, and restricted access. And this complicates efforts to deliver neutral humanitarian aid. So, Johnny, let me ask you this. How can aid organizations remain neutral and effective in politically sensitive areas such as the South China Sea?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, this certainly isn't new to the humanitarian sector, particularly on the civilian side. They've operated in Taliban areas, ISIS areas, definitely challenging areas in terms of politics. And ultimately, they're able to approach working in these environments using the four humanitarian principles: neutrality, impartiality, independence, and humanity. And these principles, for those who perhaps don't know it, a bit like commander's guidance in that military speak, that the humanitarians are always looking back at these principles when they're delivering aid. Are we able to deliver aid to those who need it? Are we able to do it in a way that isn't taking sides and that isn't prioritized without taking any direction from government? Or anything like that. But it's also a tool as well that can be used to gain access, because it's a tool that allows humanitarians to speak to military actors, political actors, civilian actors, to say, hey, we're just here to help. We're trying to build acceptance, we're trying to build trust in an area to deliver aid to people who need it. And that's how they try and remain neutral and operate in these politically sensitive areas. So, we've seen, as I mentioned, organizations operate in Taliban areas in Afghanistan. But from a military perspective, this can make it challenging, right? Because you see that, humanitarians are really operating in hostile, potentially enemy territory, and that makes it challenging to ascertain what are they doing there. But if those principles are communicated well with armed actors, that's how humanitarians can operate there. And on the flip side, militaries do have, under international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict, they do have an obligation and burden to protect civilians in those politically sensitive areas. It's hard. Sometimes people might not like it, but that's the reality. What makes the South China Sea a bit different is really the unknown of the People's Republic of China. And, it's hard to fully ascertain what their views and their actions would be, with humanitarians in that space. They don't really connect with the wider outside ecosystem, and they haven't really operated in a major conflict since the 70s. So it's hard to know exactly how they're going to act in that area. But yeah, hopefully that gives a little start. But yeah, and also just before I forget, a little caveat that these are very much my own opinions. Not any official position or policy of Naval War College, Navy, DoD, or any branch of the U.S. government. It's very much the world according to Johnny.
No, of course, that caveat will be at the front of this
Excellent.
program as well. And let's pull a little bit on what you're talking about. I mean, you've laid out in an ideal world, aid workers are protected, but protecting aid workers in high-risk regions is difficult. I mean, whether you're talking from Myanmar's conflict zones here in the region to aid operations for Rohingya refugees and typhoon-hit areas in the Philippines. I mean, humanitarian workers in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, they really do face, like they do in the worldwide, they face violence, detention, restricted access due to political instability and armed conflicts, even though ideally they should not, like you laid out. So the question might be then this: what measures can best protect aid workers while upholding humanitarian requirements?
Yeah, perfect. It's certainly a difficult one, especially last year being the highest on record for aid worker deaths in the world since records began in the late 90s. The world is getting a more dangerous place for aid workers. So it is a challenge, but, a lot of aid workers recognize that and accept a level of risk. They have quite a high risk tolerance. So that's not to say that they're very gung-ho and blasé about security or protecting themselves, but just there's an acceptance there, perhaps, that is very similar to the military in that sense. But there's a couple of ways that they try to keep themselves protected without breaching some of those principles that I talked about. I mentioned international humanitarian law and really emphasizing that to the parties in the conflict, very much at that strategic level, if you will. Those principles I mentioned are certainly important to build that acceptance and trust at a ground level, particularly from, say, targeted attacks like kidnapping or ambushes or things like that. If groups on the ground know who a humanitarian is and accept that they're there just to help, that can really help with that access. From the military side, it's also important to remember that humanitarians will be present regardless of the conflict. I remember working related to Syria, and a coalition officer there telling me that basically I had no business being within 50 miles of his AOR. But the reality of the conflict is humanitarians will be there. But at the operational level, there's various frameworks, such as the Saving Lives Together framework, that look at sharing information and best practices between groups operating in that space, that feed into kind of security management. And at the tactical level, you see standard operating procedures, training, conflict analysis, route analysis, evacuation, relocation type things, and plans that really help organizations to kind of keep their people as safe as they can. But, recognizing that when there's an armed actor that does want to deliberately target humanitarians like Russia, there's very little that can be done. But, where I've seen it work best has been when sharing information and communication between humanitarian actors and militaries has really helped with that understanding, almost like a common operating picture of sorts, where humanitarians are, where they're operating, why are they operating, and certainly helping with that. But ultimately, it's up to the parties of the conflict and whether they adhere to those international laws about not targeting humanitarians and civilians. That's my experience from Lebanon and Syria. That I operated in Syria in 2017 when the war was still going on in Damascus, and that wouldn't have been possible without that communication and dialogue. It's maybe not a perfect answer for some of the military folks in the audience, but certainly that's how civilian humanitarians approach that.
No, thank you for that, and for pulling a little bit on your own experience in some of these zones. I encourage you to do that more as we talk.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit about data-driven decisions for targeted aid. I mean, these data-driven decisions, such as using geospatial mapping for disaster impact assessments or demographic data for prioritizing vulnerability populations. I mean, these are vital for effective aid delivery in the Indo-Pacific, but they also raise significant privacy and ethical concerns. And so how then can data be used responsibly to improve humanitarian outcomes in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, certainly that kind of big data and technology is very fashionable at the moment in a lot of sectors, not just the humanitarian sector. And there's some great initiatives like the Humanitarian Data Exchange, dashboards from the Pacific Disaster Center, the International NGO Safety Organization, and others that they can really help with that situational awareness, planning, and addressing needs. But certainly, there's challenges over privacy breaches and kind of the data that is collected. So I know there's been, breaches, and you can read about this online from folks receiving aid, particularly in, say, Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees, giving some of their biometric data to the UN, and unfortunately, that data being shared with the Myanmar Burma authorities, which is very certainly puts those people in danger and is meaning that they're unlikely to be able to go back because of that risk. So there has been a few high profile cases with that, but certainly I'd say by and large, a lot of organizations that do work in that data are trying to be sensitive to the needs, only collect data when they need to, and certainly, have good privacy controls and compartmentalization of that data. But, I think for me, using it as a tool is a way to use it as responsible, in a responsible way. I've seen that, some people defer to the big data rather than use it with other tools. So I give the example of when I was working in Syria, we were providing analysis on the conflict and various offensives that were happening in 2018 with lots of data and big data and this kind of stuff. And when we're trying to advise humanitarians and say, hey, look, this offensive is coming, you might need to adapt and change your program or even take your program away from that area. And the answer I got back quite commonly was, well, I'll wait for more information instead of making a decision. And so I worry that there's, that's certainly a challenge when using data and some of these technological tools. It creates a perception that there's always something to be found when actually a decision needs to be made. And then also, I think kind of with communication and relationships, that's also, data and technology isn't going to replace that. So certainly using that data and technology with those other soft skills, if you will, to help build trust and make programs more effective.
Hmm. I want to ask you a bit about cultural sensitivity and humanitarian aid. So effective aid delivery in the Indo-Pacific requires respecting cultural practices such as religious observances and traditional leadership while navigating these political sensitivities like ethnic tensions, government restrictions, and the perceptions of foreign interference to ensure that the interventions are, in fact, both respectful and impactful. And so let me ask you this question then. How can aid organizations ensure cultural, respectful, and impactful interventions? What can they do?
Yeah, it's an important issue, certainly, and it can go wrong quite quickly if it's not thought about, and even with well-meaning people. I remember seeing in Lebanon at a Syrian refugee camp, a church group from abroad had brought a box of food, and it contained packets of pre-made pasta in red sauce, which is great. Oh, people need food, I'm going to give them that. But the problem is that in the Syrian community there, pasta and red sauce wasn't a food that they normally ate. And so I saw some of the people who received those boxes washing the red sauce off the pasta to be used in another meal. And that just to me highlights that well-meaningness, but without understanding that cultural sensitivity. But when you look at what professional humanitarian organizations do, they certainly have a couple of things that they do to really ensure that appropriate and impactful intervention. First, they often either employ a partner with people from that community, from that area, local staff, local organizations, or national level organizations So they really understand the area, the culture, the people, that, and that can, really help boost those interventions. Having international folks who are experienced in the region, maybe know the language like I did when I was in Lebanon and Syria, certainly also helped open doors as well. It gave an appreciation of folks understanding that you're here to help, and you know a little bit about my culture. Even the basics, hello, how are you, thank you, these things can go a long way there. And then humanitarians also look at trying to empower populations with that aid rather than just making them dependent. So for example, in the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, debit cards are given out to refugees there to shop in a supermarket that is stocked with items that they're familiar with, and so that allows them to remain active, to have dignity, and not just be reliant on stuff coming to them. They have the agency to go and do that. And then there are other kind of guidance documents like the Sphere Standards, which is a common standard within the humanitarian sector to estimate and deliver aid. It has key metrics for how much, for example, food is needed, how much water is needed per person per day, and this can help as well. And then the last thing I would say is certainly having a good monitoring, evaluation, assessment, and learning plan, meal plan, really helps kind of identify if those interventions are having the right impact or not.
That's fascinating. I mean, say more about about working with the leaders so that you're not circumventing their authority, but working with them. You mention more about that, if you will.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think it's, if you don't know the local context or community, you can often miss, almost, community leaders versus political leaders. So, and I actually grew up, my dad was a minister in the church in a very small village in England. And so if you had gone to that area, you would have said, the local member of parliament is the community leader in that space. When actually in that village, my father was more influential with people. And the same is in Lebanon and Syria when I've been there, that often it's religious leaders, it's even school teachers. I remember in Syria, there was actually a former school teacher that was very influential in gaining trust on both sides around the Zabadani besieged pocket. And he was able to negotiate between both sides to get aid in and out. It wasn't the military commander, it wasn't the political commissar, it was that school teacher, because he knew all the soldiers from his time teaching at school. So taking that time to understand those dynamics, and that takes time and trust and a lot of dialogue and discussion. And so you can't just come in straight away and find those things. So yeah, hopefully that gives a flavor of some of those leader discussions.
And, it does. And you mentioned about Afghanistan, a place I spent a considerable amount of time. And, even the things like, contracting for refuse pickup or something. I mean, you're suddenly through those actions, you're creating power brokers and stuff.
Yeah.
If you're not careful. And so you must have say a little bit more about what I'm alluding to about how you got to be careful.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, your experiences in Afghanistan, certainly. Yeah, it's very, very similar. I mean, it's why working with local humanitarian organizations, civil society groups, and really understanding and checking about these kind of things. When you see those big contracts kind of not really taking into consideration those local dynamics, I find that they're often more related to development actors, international development actors. So looking at how to rebuild a market, how to, rebuild bridges, repave roads, this kind of stuff, which moves more into the development side of things rather than humanitarian. And so, yeah, humanitarians, I know that Mercy Corps, for example, large US organization, has specific people, economists who look at, if we did this intervention, what will it do to the local market economy? And so many big organizations, humanitarian organizations, have that. And I'm sure many development actors do, but when I've seen some of those issues, it's more been in that development space rather than the humanitarian space.
Let's talk about responding to displacement from natural disasters. I mean, this region is prone to these, rising sea levels, prolonged droughts,
Yeah.
and these things that just can force millions of people across the region to leave their homes. And these create urgent needs that, I mean, they demand immediate relief and sustainable long-term solutions. And so, let me ask you this. What strategies are critical for addressing the growing impact of displacement from these natural disasters?
Yeah, it's a huge question and it's a huge issue. And I think, it's certainly, a short podcast won't be able to capture all the nuances for sure. But, I know that UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction have been doing a lot of work on this and they've identified really 6 priorities, trying to address, current mitigation models, needing to invest more in adaptation systems, scaling up, risk management efforts, things like this. But, many of those require these high level agreements and a cohesion between regions, countries, the world, which certainly, is a challenge. I know there's efforts being made each year at the Council of Parties, the COP, efforts there. But certainly at a more tangible level, I really think that the models for investing and releasing funds to address the impacts of these issues are a good model. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has their anticipatory action team, which are trying to predict hazards, and where they may happen, and try and understand what those impacts might be before they happen. So that means when something happens, they can have pre-agreed triggers for, okay, this is disaster. We know that these types of communities are going to be flooded. They're going to need shelter items, and it's going to cost this much. And so they're able to put these mechanisms in place before something happens. So when something happens, rather than it being a scramble, it can be this quick test. And so I know that in parts of Africa, especially, they've been really trying to boost this and really help, rather than each response being addressed each time it comes, it's more kind of sustainable and a known entity, because ultimately, funding matters, particularly in the civilian and humanitarian sector. And so having this really helps make that funding more efficient.
Yeah. I want to talk about civil military collaboration in crisis. Disaster response in the region, it relies on this civil military coordination, and we see it in operations that occur, like the U.S. military's rapid aid delivery during the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. I brought it up a couple of times, but I remember it well. Or the Philippines government's partnership with militaries after Typhoon Haiyan, and even the joint HADR exercises here in South China Sea area and stuff. However, these political sensitivities, operational differences, and perceptions of militarization, I mean, they can complicate these efforts as well. And so, what have you seen as best practices that can improve civil military cooperation for humanitarian efforts?
Yeah, it's an issue close to my heart, and I've been involved in the UN Civil Military Coordination Field Handbook update in the last 6 months that hopefully will be out later this year, and that's a great resource for folks interested in some of these best practices. But really. It's really 5 areas, I guess, that really help work. And some of them I've already said earlier, which, is that sustained dialogue between sides. That has to keep happening. It kind of, might seem like a small thing or taken for granted, but it takes a lot of work to keep that dialogue between civilian and military actors. And same with information sharing, the second key area. And particularly for militaries, that's kind of hard sometimes to share information at the unclassified level and potentially with foreign nationals. But that does happen in places like Syria, and I'll give an example of that later. And then certainly, recognizing the benefits of each side that can help with negotiations with armed actors or access to help gain access for that humanitarian purpose. And then certainly ensuring that that distinction is made between civilian and military actors. Militaries bring great capabilities and amazing problem solving skills, but sometimes just because you have it doesn't mean you should use it in some context. So recognizing the limits there and where perhaps civilians are best suited to operate in that space, and also for civilians to recognize where militaries are best suited in that space. But just giving an example on that dialogue and sustained communication, I'd meet with Operation Inherent Resolve in Jordan on a monthly basis to discuss humanitarian access, conflict dynamics in Syria, and then take that back to the humanitarian community to help them plan and anticipate what may happen in that space. And some really great things happened with that sustained dialogue. One of which was that as part of the organization I was working for, we set up a medical evacuation, medevac process in northeast Syria with Operation Inherent Resolve for humanitarians operating there. And so what that was if a humanitarian truly had an emergency, they could call us and we would call Operation Inherent Resolve, who could send a helicopter to pick up the casualty and then get them out of there, only in the emergency cases. But what that allowed humanitarians to do was not have to kind of be in an armed convoy with Operation Inherent Resolve, which would impact their neutrality in that space. But they could go further into northeast Syria after areas where ISIS used to hold had been taken back by the Syrian Democratic Forces, because many of the organizations there had a policy where they couldn't be more than 2 hours from a trauma station that could deal with a true emergency. But by having that medevac process, it allowed them to have further and further range because the helicopter could come and get them. And for Operation Inherent Resolve, it really didn't impact their day-to-day operations, what they needed to do. And then if the emergency did happen, it was good practice and training for them, for their own staff and so on and so forth. And so it really helped, both sides in that space. And it's described in that field handbook. But it wouldn't have been possible without that communication and that dialogue that was happening every month, and in some cases every 2 weeks, to make that happen. So it's there's a lot there to unpack, but my top line would certainly be the communication is key.
I could see where this close association could be a liability. The other side, I could see the humanitarian aid being co-opted by the side, and that it's only providing for one side. And while that seems clear in a conflict situation, I mean, you could see it perhaps even in a natural disaster, particularly if there are different groups and they see each side as rivalries that are competing for things. I mean, am I wrong to think this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge, and the humanitarian sector is going through a kind of reckoning and a challenge right now about that, because as much as you can say, hey, we're neutral and we're not trying to take sides, often, the reality in conflict is one side is affected more than the other, or at least the conflict we've seen in the last 50 years or so. And so humanitarians are often, particularly in, say, non-state armed group settings, supporting in those areas, but not necessarily government areas. So is that really neutral? Yes, you're prioritizing humanitarian need. Yes, you're trying to remain impartial by delivering aid to those who need it, regardless of their race or gender or whatever it might be. But can you really be neutral? And that's the challenge. And some folks, like former ICRC member Hugo Slim, has written a lot on, do you have to be neutral to be a good humanitarian? And he gives examples in World War II when various humanitarian groups really delivered aid to Jewish refugees during World War II, and not Germany, and so they weren't being neutral. And so, yet that was seen as a good thing. So it's certainly an ongoing debate at the moment, and it's certainly made harder when there's these politicized kind of conflicts that we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll pull on that, but to talk more, but I want to do it in the area of great power competition and resource allocation. So as we think about rivalries between major powers such as the United States and China, they influence the distribution and the perception of humanitarian aid. And this is even evident in China's use of hospital ships for soft power, and the U.S. has led aid initiatives in disaster hit areas like we saw in the Philippines and other places. So these dynamics, I mean, they often challenge the neutrality and independence of humanitarian efforts. So let me ask you this then. How can NGOs navigate great power competition to ensure fair and independent aid delivery?
Yeah, I mean it's an area that I look at with my research, and it's a challenging one because I think for me the reality is that there is this competition already happening in this space, whether we like it or not. And we certainly see that at the government level, as it were, between say US and China, or US and other countries, or between other countries around the world. The reality is when countries decide to deliver aid from a military or a government, that is political. There's political reasons for that, for achieving foreign policy goals, national security goals, this kind of stuff. And so even if it's noble after a disaster, there's a reason why, say, the US or the UK is responding to a disaster. When we look at the civilian humanitarian community, however, they often fall back on, well, regardless of the context, if it's a disaster, a civil war, a full-on state conflict, we'll still approach things through the humanitarian principles. We're going to be neutral, we're going to be independent, impartial, and the humanity principle. But I think it's hard because the civilians often focus, say, hey, we're not trying to do anything political that could jeopardize those principles. But often they're either co-opted or inadvertently used in this competition. And so, I give the example of, seeing UNHCR, the refugee agency. They went to the Rostov region in Russia just as the Ukraine war started. And the official UN media talked about Ukrainian refugees in these areas, which is people who have left their country, crossed the border into another. And so that, which is what that is. But when you looked at what Russia reported to its population, was that the UN was visiting internally displaced people camps, basically saying these aren't Ukrainians, these are Russians who have stayed in Russia, from that Russia perspective. And so, I think there's a like, oh well, that's not our problem, and we don't have any influence there. But being aware of some of that co-opting and that disinformation, I do think that humanitarians, are certainly not navigating it as well as they should, and certainly can increasingly get co-opted by some of these actors inadvertently, and sometimes deliberately. So it's a challenging one for sure.
Let's talk about tech for humanitarian action. So technologies, I mean, like AI, drones, satellite imagery, I mean, they're transforming the humanitarian efforts, and we've seen these even in recent responses, such as the Australia's brush fires or cyclone Amphen in 2020, and but there are ethical and logistical challenges continue to remain with these, and so I wonder, what are the key opportunities and risks in using advanced technology for humanitarian aid?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a ever expanding area for sure. And an area that I've looked at a lot is in the humanitarian demining and unexploded ordnance disposal sector in particular, where there's been great things being done with, say, drones looking to identify buried munitions, even detecting it in soil underneath the soil in sand types. Satellite mapping, looking at change detection from one day to the next. Our agricultural fields being used, are they not? And that can help with that unexploded ordnance. Light analysis as well from those same kind of satellite images. Are people returning back to areas? Are they not? Is there electricity? Is there not? And then a project I worked on and started at the Carter Center was mapping the use of explosive munitions around Syria, and using open source data and AI programs, machine learning programs to gather that information, categorize it, and then help potentially estimate, one, the number of explosive weapons used in an area or a neighborhood of a town, and then using various kind of open sources, try and potentially estimate the number of unexploded ordnance items. So then you can start mapping high risk, low risk areas, and that can help identify areas for further action, risk education, various other actions within the mine action sector. Still in its infancy, but that's an area where AI could really help improve that. But looking at the risks, I think there's sometimes a a reaction to perhaps have a one size fits all that I've seen. And so the humanitarian notification systems for deconfliction is a good example here. This is a system where humanitarians share their information with usually a neutral party like the UN, who then pass it on to military actors to say, hey, this is where humanitarians are. And that's to stop kind of inadvertent attacks against humanitarians. And there's been a lot of talk about blockchain, using that technology to track kind of the end-to-end information. So people, particularly at the end, can say, I can verify that came from a humanitarian in that location, and that means that I can trust that information. But the problem with that is, one, the data is only as good as the input, and also in some contexts, particularly like Syria, China, North Korea, where it's heavily policed, having something like that requires that technological input might not go down so well in some of those heavily police surveilled states. So there's certainly challenge. It should, when this data and this technology is put in place, it should be done in a fairly kind of context to context specific way rather than a generalized way, in my view.
Before we go to audience questions, let me ask this last question. It's about PRC's humanitarian aid and medical ships. And so, I mean, China's humanitarian assistance leverages a growing fleet of hospital ships, such as the Peace Ark, which actually just came back off of a 6-month tour, right? Yeah. I mean, this provides medical aid across the Indo-Pacific while reflecting a strategic blend of soft power and geopolitical influence. So here's the question. How does the PRC's model of humanitarian assistance, including its medical ship ecosystems, influence perceptions and responses in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, it's an area I've been looking at over the last year, using open source data from the PRC, and some things that have come out that one, PRC has a very different view of how it views humanitarian assistance, what it calls emergency humanitarian aid. It released its first ever policy related to that in 2023. which is very recent. Compare that to the US in the 1960s. So it's very much in its infancy compared to the US. But the way it approaches it is it certainly wraps up humanitarian assistance and international development together. So they're not separated as perhaps we do here in the US. And so that means the Belt and Road Initiative that is often seen as that international development vehicle is also a humanitarian assistance vehicle. It's the same thing. It's interchangeable within the policies and white papers that you read from PRC. And so this does a couple of things. This allows it, I think, PRC some flexibility when it can describe its programs to various recipient countries. It can say, hey, this is development. This is to help you improve, markets or infrastructure or whatever it might be. Or it can say, hey, this is a gift from China as humanitarian aid, and we're just trying to help you. And so it can take away that feeling of influence in that sense from some of these very large infrastructure projects. And so that's just a kind of an aside, I guess, away from its medical ships. But when we look at the Peace Ark and its sister ship, the Silk Road Ark, that did its first named mission last year to islands in the South China Sea. It's kind of interesting because when we see those medical ships, they're often involved in maritime global health engagement. They visit countries, they provide free services. And what's interesting is that what I've done is tracked where PRC does that aid in the world versus where the US Pacific Partnership and Continuing Promise, for example, does those. Again, using open source data, it's very easy to find that information. And so what I see is PRC is taking advantage in the gaps outside of where the US operates. So, for example, in certain parts of Melanesia, in the eastern Indian Ocean and East Africa, where Pacific Partnership and Continuing Promise don't really operate, Melanesia the exception there, but they really kind of pick and choose the gaps where they know it would seem the US is not having influence there. And what's interesting is that often matches up to where where they have other types of influence. So Djibouti, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, these are areas where PRC have been investing more and more in those areas. So it's certainly matching up there. And then I guess like the final thing I'll say about that about PRC is that when we look at their maritime, particularly from the maritime perspective, their medical ships are really only used for that global health engagement. They're not used for disaster response, non-combatant evacuations, as perhaps the US medical ships have been, with the exception of the Philippines in 2013. The rest of the maritime responses have been from grey hull warships. And so, I think that's certainly an interesting difference as well between China and others there. So, I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time and I want to make sure we get to questions from the audience.
If I were to push on a little bit on that, though, it would seem that there is greater need around the globe than any one country or two countries, or frankly, all the countries that are providing aid could actually give. And so I would seem like a good thing if China was providing humanitarian assistance in areas which weren't otherwise receiving it. Would you agree?
I mean, yeah, that's certainly one way to look at it. I mean, I think the challenge is that when you look at, say, the US Pacific Partnerships and Continuing Promise as an attempt to kind of make it a sustained thing, either coming back each year or kind of, linking up with the State Department, USAID, and making sure that rather than a dependence, there's a building of capacity. When you look at what PRC does, it's kind of very much one and done, never to return within kind of 5-10 years. So I kind of question how much, over time is it actually making a difference, and so that's the question I would have over particularly PRC's actions in that space.
Yeah. But so we'll go to the audience questions now. And this first one is asking us, actually it pulls a little bit further on the PRC ships, and it's asking about the future of them. And so, what assets and capabilities does China hospital ship fleet have? And are these vessels primarily designed for humanitarian missions or dual use purpose? And I think you kind of got after that, including, the combat service support. And so, how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, from the study that I've looked at, the PLA Navy has around 13 hospital ships. They have 4 main hospital ships: Peace Ark, Silk Road Ark, the Friendship, and the Friendly. And so they also have 5 ambulance transport vessels as well. And then they also have some troop transport ships that have been converted, and then some interesting two ships that basically can have modular containers put on them that have white crosses on them, but they're grey hull ships, and they call them medical ships. But under international definitions, they're not. The hull isn't painted white. They're not exclusively used for medical purposes. And certainly kind of that presents a challenge in a conflict environment in that space. And then also they've also started developing commercial hospital ships. So one has already been built for a US client, Mercy Ships, and then there's 3 currently under development in various shipyards around China as well. And so, yeah, there's a growing ecosystem of hospital ships by the PRC. And I would say that the vast majority of its ships in the PLA Navy is certainly for combat support, for sure. In the far seas, places closer to home, and then, transporting casualties from larger hospital ships to shore. So they've certainly improved that logistics bit there. But from the commercially developed ships, I would say that that's kind of a soft power thing, perhaps. They're contributing to humanitarian capabilities. They're, trying to say, hey, we're just here to help. But also it's a model that they can replicate in wartime because they've already built these ships, tested them, and then you can kind of start cranking them out fairly quickly because you've had the design. So hopefully that gives a flavor of that question. But yeah, it's certainly an area that I think is perhaps overlooked.
I think as I was looking to give a little bit of scope, the Peace Ark, the Silk Road Ark. I mean, they're like 300-bed hospital ships. They have like 8 surgical theaters in them, and so that's about so they can provide quite a bit of medical assistance in the areas that they travel into. This next question is asking about power rivalry and aid, and it's really asking, how does humanitarian assistance provided by regional superpowers, how does that influence the developing countries amid this ongoing rivalry?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer in terms of how much soft power and effect does humanitarian assistance have. And obviously it's not just humanitarian assistance only that, when it's linked up with everything from military exercises to development to other political initiatives, really all using those instruments of national power, it can help with those things. But there's been a few cases after the 2004 Indonesian earthquake and tsunami, where, relationships between Indonesia and the US improved after that. There's been a few studies done in Serbia, which is kind of interesting, with polls asking Serbians in 2020 by a news organization who gives most foreign aid to Serbia. And the top 3 answers were Russia, China, and the EU in that order, when overwhelmingly it's the EU that gives Serbia most foreign aid. And so when you look at the data of how that's presented in Serbia, the EU doesn't perhaps have such a strong kind of information environment kind of presence, whereas Russia and China have really been able to push their limited actions there. But it's certainly an area that's understudied. And certainly it's an area that I'm trying to focus down on a little bit. But it's certainly I think there is that link between influence and aid for sure.
This next question is asking about U.S. strategy on aid rivalry, and it's how can the U.S. prevent Pacific countries from leveraging aid competition between the United States and China to their advantage?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly looking at that information environment again. When you look at how, particularly in the last few years, PRC has approached some of its aid deliveries. They've been very much keen to promote their first. So their embassies will come out after a disaster with a check or some items and say, we've immediately given some aid to country X. And they'll get it all over social media and the local media. And then a few days later, maybe USAID comes or the US military or a partner or ally comes with aid. And even though it's much more sustained in actually what they may need, that doesn't translate so well. And I think kind of in that information environment, it's really key, to come up with strategies to counter that. And also, emphasize the depth of and quality of expertise that the US has. The US has been doing disaster response since the 60s. The Navy has been doing it since the late 1900s. And so really emphasizing that, hey, we're here to help and we'll keep helping and we'll keep turning up and showing up to any crises time and time again. Whereas, I think kind of PRC is still very much kind of very much isolated cases and not sustained cases in the humanitarian realm. This is yeah, not sure if that fully answers the question, but certainly maybe it's a start.
No, and two things I was thinking about. One is you're right. I mean, PRC is new to this. Even the peace arc has only been commissioned since like 2008, so less than 20 years into this.
Yeah.
So they're developing a lot. The other thing you had given a response before, which made me think on how to keep one countries from playing the two off each other, and some of that is through routinization of humanitarian missions and stuff where it's less reactive, and you had kind of alluded to that earlier, which made me think on this. This next question is asking about Washington versus Beijing consensus. How do the Washington and Beijing consensus differ in shaping approaches to humanity and geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obviously with the change in administration, it's kind of hard to know exactly how any new policies may shape that. But looking at how PRC approaches humanitarian aid and that kind of thing, as I mentioned, they have a very different perspective. Also interestingly, in a lot of their earlier documents from the early kind of 2010s or so, they don't really talk about saving lives, alleviating suffering. Instead, they talk about protecting property first. And that's kind of telling, right? In terms of how, and that links to how, PRC links its international development with its aid. And so, yeah, they do very much have very different perspectives. And I think sometimes it can be misunderstood. And, I'll give an example. It's not a Washington example, but instead a ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross example, when the former head of ICRC, Peter Maurer, went to visit Beijing, I think it was in 2020, and basically came out with a statement afterwards, and you can read about it online, that said, I spoke to Beijing and, we agreed that there needs to be more humanitarian assistance in the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, as I mentioned before, if you read the policies from China, the Belt and Road Initiative is a humanitarian vehicle already. So that's like saying USAID needs to do more humanitarian assistance. Well, they're already doing humanitarian assistance. So it shows that fundamental misunderstanding. So when you think you might be speaking the same language, as it were, you're perhaps on very different perspectives. So recognizing that difference, I think, is key.
Johnny, this hour together has flown by. We've got many more questions we're not going to get to, but before we let you go, I want you to give a book recommendation to our audience.
Yeah, sure. So there's a book that's recently been written by the Navy History and Heritage Command that focuses on the US Navy's role in humanitarian assistance. It's by John Sherwood. It's called A Global Force for Good: Sea Services, Humanitarian Operations in the 21st Century, and really dives down into many of the things that I've talked about today.
Thank you for that, and thanks for this time with us, Johnny. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
As we conclude today's dialogue, humanitarian assistance in the Indo-Pacific is at an inflection point of urgency and complexity, driven by natural disasters, geopolitical rivalries, and advancement in technology. Navigating these challenges demands thoughtful collaboration, ethical decision-making, and a commitment to neutrality in politically sensitive regions. These conversations shape security. Join us on February 3rd when Professors Sham Takwani and Lami Kim interview me about the release of our new book, The Indo-Pacific Mosaic: Comprehensive Security Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, exploring critical strategies for regional and security cooperation. On behalf of all of us at DKI APCSS, thank you for being part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oi.
As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.